Hey class, this is an introductory lecture on poetry, the forms and terms that we're going to use for this first unit. So I'm going to go and draw your attention to Canvas. So this PowerPoint right here, you can go back to this. I'm going to just quickly go over it in this lecture. So there's two forms of poetry. We're going to start with the formal side of it because when we move later on to the more informal and the more modern, you really do want to know where all of those forms have come from, right? What are the roots of poetry today? And so that's why we're going to be looking at the formal. An example of formal is something that has a very strict set of rules and technical structures. For example, a Shakespearean sonnet or a Petrarchan sonnet. So for example, this is a Shakespearean sonnet. There's a specific number of lines that it does not go over or under. There's a rhyme scheme that is very specific as well. There's a whole formula to it, a whole kind of mathematical formula, which we will talk about. So that's an example of formal poetry. Then there's the informal, more free verse modern form. This is something that you probably are already aware of. You don't even know it. If you read song lyrics, if you read hip hop lyrics, if you like spoken word, all of this stuff comes from the informal. A great example is Ginsberg's Howl, which we are going to be studying. And just to show you an example, like, so here's Shakespeare, right? All tight and specific, and then boom, Howl. It's very much removed from the formal. It does have a set of rules, and it does follow a structure, which we will talk about, but it's definitely much more relaxed and open, and you know, it's a wild thing to read. So we'll talk about this as we go along. To give you a more visual representation of what I'm talking about, let's look at art. So on the left, we have formal art, right? Usually is based in realism, a depiction of a real human. Or someone that looks like they are a real human. And then on the right, you've got the more informal modern art, right? So the one on the left is probably a lot easier to depict as far as like what are the structures, what are the techniques, and the one on the right is some would consider messy and confusing and just noise, right? It's not, there is a structure to it, but that would be an example of two different types of formal versus informal art. We're not going to study all of the poetry styles, but we are going to be looking at Imagist first. We're going to be looking at confessional, satirical, and the epic. Speaker of poetry is really important. You always want to figure out who is speaking, you know, what do they want to say. But something really important to think about is that the poem is not always in the perspective of the writer. A lot of readers make this mistake. You never want to assume that the poem is about the writer ever, especially with Shakespeare. Like, people just assume Shakespeare's writing all these love sonnets to these people, and honestly, it's not the case at all. Like, we'll talk about this, but you always want to be very careful about who you assume the speaker of a poem is, and you don't want to just assume it's the writer. Here's some questions that you can ask to figure out who the speaker is or to figure out motivations, thinking about their tone, whom are they speaking to, what's their emotional state, why are they speaking. This is really important. What are the conflicts and tensions within the situation? Almost all poetry and sonnets usually have some problem that they're trying to solve. What is the setting? And then also very important is what are the ideas that are being communicated? What is the thing that the speaker wants you to take away from the poem itself? Imagery is really important, especially in these first poems that we're going to be looking at, thinking about the senses, thinking about analogies, images, metaphors to be revealed, descriptions, states of mind, impressions. You know, all these things are really important when you're trying to get to the imagery within the poems. Here's a link. I'm just going to pull it up. So these are some terms when we're talking about poetry and the forms. We don't have to use all of them, but it's good to like familiarize yourself with some of these, especially when you're writing, you know, your discussion posts and your response papers. We're not going to go over all of them, but we are going to talk about metaphor. We're going to talk about irony. We're going to talk about tension, symbolism, you know, all those kinds of things. Structure, all very important when we're talking about poetry for sure. Okay. New criticism. So I don't want to go too into this, but it is important. So there was a movement in the poetry kind of world and academia where people really were like, we need to focus on only the art itself, nothing else, right? So basically what that means is it's a close reading of the text itself. Or if you're looking at, let's say, modern art, right? Um, I think the new critics would really dislike this type of modern art. They want to look at this because they can really talk about the technique, you know, what's being done, the use of color, the use of the strokes, the use of realism, right? This would all appeal to them. And they really brought that to poetry itself. To me, this is kind of an elitist perspective. We'll talk more about that later. But one big thing, and probably the most important thing for them, is you never consider historical or cultural context when you're talking about poetry. We'll talk about the problems of that later. But just know that this was like a huge uprising in the 40s. The things that they really did focus on, which we are also going to focus on, are things like metaphor, symbolism, irony, tension, and paradox. But, you know, there's so much more to poetry and art than just these things. We'll talk about that as we go along. Here's a formal definition of new criticism. And John Crowe Ransom, he's, again, a big new critic. But I think his first line really says it all. Poetry is a different form of prose on the technical side by the devices which are its means of escaping the prose. So basically what they wanted to do is they wanted to elevate poetry so that it was more than just prose, right? It was more than just some writing. And they really wanted to, again, I think it's kind of an elitist perspective, but they wanted to create this whole type of language around how we speak about poetry. But yeah. And then here's some of the poems we're going to be looking at in the first week that really actually come out of the new critical movement and are really imagist poems. But I am going to show you kind of the other side of them as well as we go along. So another resource that you might want to check out is the poetry chart. This might just help you as we're reading the poetry as you're breaking it down. And it really talks about, you know, things like form and style, the speaker, the setting, turning points, tension, diction, theme. So you may want to use this. It's not required, but I just wanted to give it to you as an option. Okay. Also, just keep in mind that the week 1 readings are here. These are all the readings we're going to be looking at for the first unit. You also want to read the rhetoric, this little introduction. I went over a little bit of it, but okay. So that's basically it. If you guys have any questions, please don't hesitate to message me. Okay, bye.